The coffee shop on Elm Street hummed with the familiar December rhythm of espresso machines and muffled conversations, the windows fogged with condensation that blurred the Christmas lights strung across the street outside. Megan Clark sat at a corner table, her fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug that had grown cold while she waited, the steam having long since dissipated into the warm air that smelled of cinnamon and roasted beans. She checked her phone for the fourth time in 10 minutes, the blue light illuminating her face in the growing dusk of late afternoon, December 23rd, 2021. Her friend Sarah had insisted on setting her up, had practically begged her to give dating another chance after 3 years of polite refusals and carefully constructed excuses. "You need to get back out there, Megan," Sarah had said over lunch the week before, her voice carrying that particular tone of gentle insistence that close friends reserve for interventions they believe necessary. "It's been long enough. He's a friend of David's from work, an architect, divorced, no kids, loves dogs and old movies. What could go wrong?" Everything, Megan had thought then. And everything, she thought now as she watched people hurry past the windows bundled in winter coats, their breath visible in small puffs that dissipated quickly in the cold Dallas air. She had agreed to the blind date, partly to appease Sarah, and partly because some small, stubborn part of her heart had begun to whisper that maybe it was time, maybe she was ready to try again. Maybe the careful walls she had built around herself over the past few years had grown too high, too thick, too impenetrable. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up expectantly, but it was just an elderly man with a newspaper tucked under his arm. She returned her attention to her phone, scrolling through emails she had already read, anything to avoid the familiar sensation of being stood up, of waiting for someone who might not come, of hope curdling slowly into disappointment, and then hardening into the kind of cynicism she had worked so hard to avoid. But then the bell chimed again, and when she looked up this time, her breath caught in her throat with such force that she nearly knocked over her cold coffee. Thomas Miller stood in the doorway, snowflakes melting in his dark hair, his brown eyes scanning the coffee shop with the same nervous energy she remembered from years ago. He wore a navy peacoat that she didn't recognize and carried himself with a slightly different posture, more careful somehow, more deliberate, but there was no mistaking the man who had once promised to love her forever and then disappeared from her life with nothing but a note left on her kitchen counter. For a moment, that stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. They simply stared at each other. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions she could read even from across the room. Surprise giving way to recognition, giving way to something that looked almost like panic. She watched him take a half-step backward, toward the door, and she realized with sudden clarity that he was going to leave, was going to turn around and walk back out into the December evening and disappear from her life for a second time. She stood up before she could think better of it, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet that had settled around them. Thomas stopped moving toward the door. Their eyes met across the coffee shop, and she saw in his face the same mixture of pain and longing that she felt in her chest, a complicated knot of emotions that had never fully untangled despite the years that had passed since she last saw him. He approached her table slowly, as if walking through water, and when he reached her he stood for a moment without speaking. Up close she could see the ways time had changed him. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a slight grey threaded through his hair at the temples, a weariness in his expression that spoke of experiences she knew nothing about. But his hands were the same hands she remembered, long-fingered and gentle, and when he spoke his voice carried the same soft cadence that had once whispered her name in the dark. "I think there's been some kind of mistake," he said, and she heard the careful control in his tone, the way he was working to keep his voice steady. "I was supposed to meet someone here, a blind date, but clearly there's been a mix-up." Sarah set this up, didn't she? Megan said, and it wasn't really a question. She could see the truth of it in his face, the same dawning realization that was settling over her, like a blanket. She wasn't sure she wanted to pull closer. Your friend David works with my friend Sarah. They planned this. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, and she watched him take a deep breath before opening them again. I should go, he said. This isn't fair to you. I should have realized, should have asked more questions before agreeing to this. But he didn't move to leave, and she didn't sit back down. They stood there in the space between her table and his hesitation, two people who had once known each other's dreams and fears and favorite songs, now strangers wearing the faces of their younger selves. Around them, the coffee shop continued its evening rhythm, other conversations flowing like water around the rock of their silence. Don't, she said finally, and the word came out softer than she had intended. Don't go. Not yet. He searched her face as if looking for permission or forgiveness or simply the answer to a question he didn't know how to ask. Slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She settled back into her own seat, her hands finding their way back to her cold coffee mug, needing something to anchor her in the surreal reality of this moment. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 3 years and all the words they had never said to each other settling between them like snow accumulating on a windowsill. She studied his face, noting the changes time had carved there, wondering what he saw when he looked at her. She had changed too, she knew. The woman sitting across from him was not the same person who had stood in a wedding dress in an empty church, waiting for a groom who never came. "How have you been?" he asked eventually, and the mundane nature of the question almost made her laugh. How did you answer a question like that, when the person asking it had once known every detail of your daily life, had shared your bed and your hopes and your fears, had promised to stand beside you through everything life might bring, and then had vanished without explanation, leaving behind nothing but a note that said he was sorry and he had to go and he would always love her? "I've been fine," she said, because it was easier than the truth. Because fine was a word that covered a multitude of experiences, from genuinely content to barely surviving. "I finished my master's degree. I'm teaching now, high school English. I have an apartment in Oak Cliff, a small place, but I like it. I adopted a cat last year. Her name is Virginia, after Woolf." She watched his face as she spoke, saw something soften in his expression at the mention of the cat, at the detail about Virginia Woolf, because he would remember how much she had loved that author, how she had written her senior thesis on the Hours and had read him passages aloud during the lazy Sunday mornings they used to share. It was a small offering of intimacy, a glimpse into the life she had built without him, and she saw that he received it as such. "That's good," he said, and she could hear that he meant it. "I always knew you'd be an amazing teacher. Your students are lucky to have you." The compliment settled between them, carrying with it the echo of all the encouragement he had given her during their years together, the way he had believed in her dreams, even when she struggled to believe in them herself. It was both comforting and painful, a reminder of what they had been to each other and what they had lost. "What about you?" she asked, because it seemed like the natural progression of the conversation, because she was curious, despite herself, about the life he had built after leaving her behind. Thomas looked down at his hands, clasped together on the table between them. "I moved to Seattle," he said, "took a job with a firm there. I've been working mostly on residential projects, some commercial work. It's been good, challenging, different from what I was doing here." He paused and she waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say, but wasn't sure how to begin. The coffee shop was getting busier as the evening progressed, people stopping in for their post-dinner caffeine fix or meeting friends before heading out for the night. Their table felt like an island of quiet in the growing bustle, a private space carved out of the public world around them. "I got married," he said finally, the words coming out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back and they had escaped despite his efforts to contain them. 2 years ago. To a woman named Jennifer. She's a pediatrician. We met through mutual friends, and she's wonderful, really wonderful, kind and smart and patient, everything anyone could want in a partner. Megan felt something twist in her chest at this revelation, a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't immediately untangle. Relief, because it meant he had moved on, had found happiness after the mess he had made of their relationship. Jealousy, because she had not been able to do the same, had tried dating, but had never found anyone who made her feel the way Thomas once had. Curiosity, because his tone when he spoke about his wife suggested complications she couldn't quite identify. That's wonderful, she said, and tried to mean it. I'm happy for you. I really am. Thomas looked up at her then, and she saw something like gratitude in his eyes, as if her blessing mattered to him in ways she didn't fully understand. But there was something else there too, something that looked almost like regret or sorrow, and she found herself wondering about the story he wasn't telling, the details hidden beneath the surface of his careful summary. "What about you?" he asked. "Are you seeing anyone? Married? I know it's not really my business anymore, but—" He trailed off, and she shook her head. "I've dated some," she said. "Nothing serious. Nothing that stuck. I think I became pretty good at keeping people at arm's length after what happened with us." She watched him absorb this information, saw something that might have been pain flicker across his features before he controlled his expression again. They fell back into silence, but it was a different quality of quiet now, less shocked and more contemplative, as if they were both trying to process the strange turns their lives had taken to bring them to this moment. "Why are you here?" she asked eventually. "In Dallas, I mean. If you live in Seattle now, what brought you back?" Thomas shifted in his chair, and she sensed they were approaching something difficult, some part of his story that he wasn't eager to share. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Christmas lights that had begun to twinkle more brightly as the sky darkened toward true night. "My brother," he said finally. "Marcus. He's sick. Cancer. He was diagnosed 6 months ago, and the doctors here at Baylor have a treatment program that's supposed to be one of the best in the country. So Jennifer and I moved back temporarily. We're staying with my parents while he goes through treatment." "Oh, Thomas," she said, and the words came out full of genuine sympathy because she remembered Marcus, remembered the way Thomas had talked about his younger brother with such protective affection, remembered meeting him at family gatherings and seeing how much the two of them meant to each other, despite the 3 years that separated them. "I'm so sorry. How is he doing?" "Better now," Thomas said, and for the first time since he had sat down, she heard something like genuine warmth in his voice. "The treatment is working. His last scan showed significant improvement. The doctors are optimistic that he'll make a full recovery. It's been a hard few months, but we're hopeful." She nodded, understanding now why he was back in the city that had once been home to both of them, why he had agreed to a blind date set up by mutual friends, despite being married. The stress of caring for a sick family member could strain even the strongest relationships, could make people reach for connection and comfort in unexpected places. She wondered about Jennifer, about what it must be like to uproot your life, to care for your husband's brother, about whether Thomas's marriage was as wonderful as he had made it sound. "I can't imagine how difficult that must be," she said, "for all of you. Marcus is lucky to have you and Jennifer supporting him through this." Something shifted in Thomas's expression at the mention of his wife's name, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that she might have missed if she hadn't once known his face so well. But he nodded and managed a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "She is remarkable," he said. "Jennifer, she took a leave of absence from her practice to be here to help with Marcus's care. She's been incredible through all of this, more than I deserve. There was something in the way he said those last words that made Megan look at him more closely, that made her wonder if there were cracks in the wonderful marriage he had described, fractures that might have been caused by stress or distance or the weight of old regrets. But it wasn't her place to ask. Wasn't her business to probe the vulnerable places in his current life, when her own presence here probably represented a complication he didn't need. "I should probably go," she said, starting to gather her purse and coat. "This is strange enough without making it stranger by staying longer. I hope Marcus continues to improve, and I hope things work out well for all of you." But as she stood to leave, Thomas reached across the table and touched her hand, just briefly, just long enough to make her pause and look back at him. His fingers were warm against her skin, familiar in a way that made her chest ache with the memory of all the times those hands had touched her with love and tenderness and promise. "Megan," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a prayer or an apology or both. "I know I don't have the right to ask this, and I know it's probably not fair to either of us, but would you consider having dinner with me tomorrow? Christmas Eve, just to talk. There are things I should have said 3 years ago, things I should have explained, and I know it's probably too late for explanations to matter, but I would like the chance to try." She stared down at him, at his earnest face and the hope and uncertainty written there, and felt herself standing at the edge of a decision that could change everything or nothing, that could bring her peace or reopen wounds that had finally begun to heal. Part of her wanted to say no, wanted to protect herself from whatever pain might come from giving him the chance to explain himself. But another part of her, the part that had loved him completely and had never quite understood why he had left, wanted those explanations more than she wanted safety. "I don't know if that's a good idea," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew she was going to say yes, knew that the need to understand what had happened between them was stronger than her instinct for self-preservation. "One dinner," Thomas said, "one conversation, and then if you want me to disappear from your life again, I will, I promise." She looked at him for a long moment, studying his face, trying to read the sincerity there, trying to gauge whether he was capable of keeping such a promise. Finally she nodded. "One dinner," she agreed, "but somewhere public, and I drive myself." He smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since he walked into the coffee shop, and for just a moment she could see the man she had once planned to marry, the man who had made her laugh and held her when she cried and promised her forever. "Thank you," he said. "There's a place on Bishop Street, Lucia. Do you know it? Italian. We could meet there at 7. She knew the restaurant, had driven past it many times, but had never been inside. It seemed appropriately neutral, public enough to feel safe, but intimate enough for the kind of conversation he seemed to want to have. "I'll be there," she said. And then, because standing there much longer would make leaving even harder, she turned and walked toward the door. She could feel his eyes on her as she left, could sense him watching her go the way she had once watched him disappear from her life without warning or explanation. The cold air hit her face as she stepped outside, sharp and clean, and full of the promise of snow that might or might not come. She walked to her car slowly, her mind spinning with the impossibility of what had just happened, with the strange turns fate sometimes takes when you least expect them. 3 years ago, Thomas Miller had left her standing at the altar of St. Matthew's Cathedral in a wedding dress that had cost more than her first car, surrounded by 200 guests who had come to witness their love story, and instead had witnessed her humiliation. Tonight, he had walked back into her life through the door of a coffee shop on Elm Street, married to someone else, but asking for a chance to explain himself. And she had said yes. She sat in her car for several minutes before starting the engine, letting the heater warm the small space while she tried to process what had just occurred. Through the coffee shop window, She could see Thomas, still sitting at their table, his head in his hands, and she wondered what thoughts were running through his mind, what emotions were coursing through him as he tried to reconcile the life he had built in Seattle with the life he had abandoned here in Dallas. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, probably wanting to know how the blind date had gone, whether David's architect friend had lived up to his billing. Megan looked at the message preview but didn't open it, didn't trust herself to find the words to explain what had happened, didn't think she could make Sarah understand that the carefully orchestrated setup had instead become the most surreal evening of her life. She drove home through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, past houses decorated with Christmas lights and inflatable lawn ornaments, past families loading last-minute gifts into their cars, and couples walking hand-in-hand through the mild December evening. Her apartment felt smaller than usual when she unlocked the door, more cramped and lonely. Though whether that was because of Thomas's unexpected reappearance or simply the result of her own shifting emotional state, she couldn't say. Virginia greeted her with the kind of imperious meowing that cats reserve for humans who have disrupted their evening routine, and Megan scooped up the orange tabby and buried her face in the soft fur, needing the simple comfort of unconditional affection. The cat purred against her chest, a vibration that seemed to help settle her racing thoughts, and she carried Virginia to the couch where they settled together in their usual evening configuration. But instead of reaching for the stack of papers she needed to grade, or the book she had been reading, Megan found herself staring at the wall where she had once hung a photograph of her and Thomas from their engagement party, a picture that had been replaced long ago with a print of Klimt's The Kiss that she had bought during a solo trip to Vienna the summer after their wedding that never happened. She remembered taking down all the pictures of them, remembered the cathartic ritual of sorting through the physical evidence of their relationship and deciding what to keep and what to discard and what to store away in boxes that still sat in her closet. She had kept more than she had thrown away, she realized now. The engagement ring had gone back to the jewelry store, but she had kept the letters he had written her during the brief period when he had traveled for work, had kept the program from the first play they had seen together, had kept a T-shirt of his that she had claimed as her own and still occasionally wore to bed on nights when loneliness felt particularly acute. These keepsakes lived in a shoebox on the top shelf of her bedroom closet, artifacts of a love story that had never reached its intended conclusion, and she wondered now whether keeping them had been a form of hope or simply an inability to fully let go. The next evening came too quickly and not quickly enough. Megan spent Christmas Eve day in a state of nervous anticipation that made it impossible to concentrate on any of the tasks she had planned to accomplish. She cleaned her already clean apartment, reorganized her bookshelves, started and abandoned 3 different books, and finally resorted to a long walk through the Bishop Arts District, partly to kill time and partly to familiarize herself with the area around the restaurant where she would meet Thomas. Lucia turned out to be smaller than she had expected, an intimate space with exposed brick walls and dim lighting that created the kind of atmosphere meant for quiet conversations and romantic dinners. She arrived 10 minutes early and asked for a table near the back, somewhere they could talk without being overheard, and then sat nervously adjusting her silverware while she waited for Thomas to arrive. He appeared in the doorway at exactly 7 o'clock, scanning the restaurant until his eyes found her. He was wearing a dark sweater that brought out the brown in his eyes and made his hair look almost black in the low lighting. And as he walked toward her table, she was struck again by how familiar he looked, despite the years that had passed. How her body seemed to remember his presence even when her mind insisted on treating him as a stranger. "Thank you for coming," he said as he sat down across from her, his voice carrying the same careful gratitude it had held the night before. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, because it seemed important to be honest with him. to establish a foundation of truth that might support whatever conversation they were about to have. But I realized I need to hear whatever it is you want to tell me. I've spent 3 years wondering what happened, why you left, what I did wrong. Maybe it's time I got some answers. Thomas nodded, but before he could respond, their waiter appeared to take their drink order. They both asked for wine, red for her and white for him, a detail that made her smile slightly because he had always preferred white wine, while she gravitated toward reds. And they had once joked that their marriage would require significant compromise in the area of wine selection. When they were alone again, Thomas leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together on the table between them. "I want you to know," he began, "that leaving you wasn't a choice I made lightly. It wasn't because I stopped loving you, or because I met someone else, or because I got cold feet about marriage. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, and not a day has passed since then that I haven't regretted the way I handled it." "Then why?" she asked, the question that had haunted her for 3 years, finally finding its voice. "Why did you leave me standing there? Why couldn't you at least tell me to my face? Do you have any idea what that was like for me? Waiting in that church, watching our friends and family realize that something was wrong, having to tell everyone that the wedding was cancelled without knowing why myself." Thomas closed his eyes, and she could see pain written across his features, the kind of anguish that comes from remembering moments you would give anything to change. When he opened his eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears. "Marcus," he said simply. It was about Marcus. She waited for him to continue, her heart beating faster as she sensed they were approaching the heart of his explanation, the truth that might finally make sense of the catastrophe that had ended their relationship. "The morning of our wedding," Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "Marcus called me. He was in trouble, serious trouble. He had been involved with some people, dangerous people, and he owed them a significant amount of money. They were threatening to kill him if he didn't pay up by the end of that day." Megan stared at him, trying to process what he was telling her. She remembered Marcus as a sweet kid, maybe a little wild, but nothing that had ever seemed truly dangerous. The idea of him mixed up with people who would threaten his life seemed impossible. But the pain in Thomas's voice suggested he was telling her the truth. He had been gambling, Thomas explained. Started small, just weekend poker games, but it escalated. He got in over his head, borrowed money from the wrong people to cover his losses, and when he couldn't pay them back, they made it clear that they would hurt him or hurt our family if he didn't find the money immediately. "But why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "We could have figured it out together. We could have found another way." Thomas shook his head, his expression full of regret. "They were specific about their threats. They said if I involved anyone else, if I brought in the police or told our family, they would hurt Marcus first and then go after everyone I cared about. They mentioned you by name, Megan. They knew about the wedding, knew we were getting married that afternoon, and they made it clear that if I didn't come up with the money alone, without telling anyone, you would be in danger too." The wine arrived, but neither of them reached for their glasses. Megan felt as if the world had shifted slightly off its axis, as if everything she had believed about their breakup was rearranging itself into a new and completely different picture. "So what did you do?" she asked. "I liquidated everything I could get my hands on quickly," Thomas said. "My savings, some investments. I even sold my car to a dealer that morning for cash. But it wasn't enough. I needed more, and I needed it immediately. So I went to see Tony Marconi." Megan recognized the name. Tony Marconi was a local businessman with rumored connections to organized crime, the kind of man who could solve certain problems for people willing to pay his prices and accept his terms. "He gave me the money," Thomas continued, "but his terms were non-negotiable. I had to leave Dallas that day, immediately after paying off Marcus's debt. I had to disappear completely, couldn't contact anyone, couldn't explain where I was going or why. If I tried to reach out to family or friends, if I tried to contact you, he would consider our deal void and Marcus would be back in danger. How long? She asked, her voice barely audible. How long were you supposed to stay away? 3 years, Thomas said. Minimum. No contact, no communication, no return visits. If I followed his rules exactly, stayed away completely for 3 years, then Marcus would be safe and I would be free to rebuild my life however I wanted. Megan reached for her wine glass with a hand that was not entirely steady. 3 years. He had been protecting his brother and, by extension, protecting her and their families. But the cost had been their relationship, their wedding, their entire future together. Why couldn't you have just told me, she asked. Even if you couldn't stay, even if you had to leave, why couldn't you have explained? I would have understood. I would have waited. Thomas looked at her with an expression of such profound sadness that she felt her own eyes fill with tears. Because I loved you too much to ask you to wait for something that might never happen. Because I knew that if I told you the truth, you would have tried to find another way, would have put yourself at risk, would have spent 3 years of your life in limbo waiting for me to come back. You deserved better than that. You deserved a chance to move on, to find happiness with someone who could actually be there for you. But that wasn't your decision to make, she said, and she could hear the anger creeping into her voice, anger that had been buried under years of hurt and confusion, but was now rising to the surface. You didn't get to decide what I could handle or what I deserved. You didn't get to choose for both of us. You're right, Thomas said immediately. You're absolutely right, and I've regretted that choice every day for 3 years. I should have trusted you with the truth. I should have let you make your own decisions about what you wanted to do. But I was terrified, and I was desperate, and I convinced myself that protecting you meant pushing you away. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of his revelation settling between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples out in all directions. Megan took a sip of her wine and tried to organize her thoughts, tried to process not just what he had told her, but what it meant for how she understood their relationship and its ending. "Is Marcus safe now?" she asked finally. "Yes," Thomas said, and for the first time that evening, his voice carried a note of relief. The 3 years are up. Tony honored his word, and Marcus is free and clear. He's actually doing well. Had been clean from gambling for 2 years, even before his cancer diagnosis. He got help, real help, and he's rebuilt his life. He's engaged now to a wonderful woman named Lisa, and they're planning to get married next summer. And Jennifer, Megan said, though she wasn't entirely sure why she was asking about his wife. Does she know about why you left Dallas? About Marcus? About me? Thomas looked down at his hands, and she saw the answer in his expression before he spoke. "Some of it," he said. "She knows about Marcus's gambling problem and about the danger that brought me to Seattle. But she doesn't know about Tony Marconi, doesn't know about the specific terms of the arrangement I made. And she doesn't know that you were the woman I was supposed to marry the day I disappeared." "Why not?" Megan asked, though she thought she could guess the answer. "Because I was afraid she would realize that I never got over you," Thomas said quietly. "Because every time someone mentions Dallas or asks about my past, I think about you. Because when Marcus got sick and we had to move back here, the first thing I wanted to do was find you and try to explain what happened, even though I'm married to someone else and have no right to want that." The honesty of his admission hung in the air between them, creating a moment of intimacy that felt both familiar and dangerous. Megan found herself looking at his hands where they rested on the table, remembering the way those fingers used to trace patterns on her skin, the way he used to hold her hand when they walked down the street together, the way he had slipped an engagement ring onto her finger and promised her forever. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Why are we here having this conversation? You're married, Thomas. You made a life with someone else. What's the point of explaining all this now? I don't know, he admitted, and she could hear the confusion in his voice. The uncertainty of a man who had acted on impulse and was now trying to understand his own motivations. Maybe I just needed you to know that leaving you wasn't a choice I made freely. Maybe I needed you to understand that I never stopped loving you, even when I was building a life with someone else. Maybe I just wanted to apologize, really apologize, for the pain I caused you. He paused, staring out the restaurant window at the Christmas lights that twinkled on the street outside. Or maybe, he continued, his voice so quiet she had to lean forward to hear him, maybe I hoped that knowing the truth would help both of us find some kind of closure, some way to make peace with what happened between us. Their food arrived, but neither of them seemed particularly interested in eating. They picked at their meals while continuing to talk, the conversation flowing more easily now that the central truth had been revealed. Thomas told her about Seattle, about the architectural firm where he worked, about the house he and Jennifer had bought in a neighborhood near the water. Megan told him about her students, about the satisfaction she found in teaching, about the small but meaningful life she had built for herself in Dallas. But underlying their careful exchange of life updates was a current of something deeper, something that had never been fully resolved between them, despite the years and distance, and the other relationships they had both pursued. When Thomas laughed at something she said about her students, his eyes crinkled in exactly the same way they had when he was 26 and they were planning their future together. When Megan tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, it was the same unconscious gesture that had once made him stop mid-sentence, just to tell her how beautiful she was. "I should ask," Thomas said, as they were finishing their wine, "about your life now. Are you happy, Megan? Really happy?" She considered the question seriously, turning it over in her mind like a stone she was examining for cracks or hidden facets. "I'm content," she said finally. "I have work that I love, friends who care about me, a life that feels meaningful and stable. I'm not unhappy, but I think there's a difference between contentment and happiness, and I'm not sure I've figured out how to get from one to the other." Thomas nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "I feel the same way," he said. "Jennifer is wonderful, and our marriage is solid, and I should be happy. I am grateful, definitely. But there's something missing, something I can't quite name or find." They looked at each other across the table, and Megan felt the dangerous pull of old intimacy, the temptation to reach across the space between them and touch his hand, to offer comfort or seek connection, or simply acknowledge the bond that still existed between them, despite everything that had happened. Instead, she glanced at her watch and was surprised to see that they had been talking for more than 2 hours. "I should probably go," she said. "It's getting late, and I imagine Jennifer is expecting you home." Thomas nodded, though she thought she saw reluctance in his expression. "You're right," he said. "But Megan, before you go, I want you to know how much this evening has meant to me. Getting to explain, getting to talk to you again, it's given me something I didn't know I needed." "Me too," she said, and realized it was true. The anger and confusion that had lived in her chest for 3 years felt lighter somehow, transformed into something that was still painful, but no longer sharp-edged and consuming. They split the check and walked outside together, standing on the sidewalk in the mild December air while other couples strolled past them, many holding hands or walking with the easy familiarity of long partnership. For a moment, Megan could almost imagine that she and Thomas were one of those couples, that they were simply ending a pleasant dinner before heading home together to the life they had once planned to share. "My car is around the corner," she said, breaking the spell that seemed to have settled over them. "Mine too," Thomas said, gesturing in the opposite direction. "Different corner." They stood there for another moment, neither quite ready to take the steps that would carry them away from each other and back to their separate lives. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Would it be all right if I hugged you?" he asked. "Just to say goodbye properly?" She nodded, not trusting her voice, and stepped into his arms. He held her carefully, as if she were something precious and fragile, and she breathed in the scent of his cologne, mixed with something that was just, essentially him. A smell that was so familiar, it made her chest ache with remembered longing. For just a moment, she let herself remember what it had felt like to belong to someone completely, to trust in a love that felt permanent and unshakable. When they separated, she could see unshed tears in his eyes, and she knew her own eyes were probably bright with emotion as well. "Take care of yourself, Megan," he said, "and thank you for listening, for giving me the chance to explain. It means more than you know." "Take care of Marcus," she replied, "and Jennifer. I hope his recovery continues to go well." Thomas nodded and turned to walk toward his car, but after a few steps, he looked back at her. "Megan," he called softly, "I want you to know that what we had, what we were together, it was real. It was the most real thing in my life, and losing it, losing you, it changed me in ways I'm still figuring out." She stood on the sidewalk and watched him walk away until he disappeared around the corner, and then she stood there for several more minutes, letting the December air cool her flushed cheeks and trying to process the complex mixture of emotions that was coursing through her. The drive home passed in a blur of Christmas lights and radio carols and her own swirling thoughts. She found herself thinking not just about Thomas and his revelations, but about the choices people make when they love someone, about the ways fear can masquerade as protection, about the difference between loving someone and being able to build a life with them. Back in her apartment, Virginia greeted her with suspicious sniffs, as if detecting the scent of another person's cologne on her clothes. Megan changed into comfortable pajamas and settled on her couch with a cup of tea, but found herself too restless to sit still. Instead, she found herself walking to her bedroom closet, reaching up to the top shelf, and pulling down the shoebox that contained the remnants of her relationship with Thomas. She hadn't opened it in more than a year, but tonight felt like the right time to revisit these artifacts of their love story. There were the letters he had written during his business trips, full of observations about whatever city he was visiting and assurances that he missed her and couldn't wait to get home. There was the program from their first play together, a production of Romeo and Juliet that had made them both cry during the balcony scene. There were ticket stubs from movies they had seen together, receipts from restaurants where they had shared meaningful meals, a pressed flower from the bouquet he had given her on their first Valentine's Day. At the bottom of the box, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was the T-shirt of his that she had claimed as her own, a soft grey cotton shirt with the logo of his college architecture program. She unfolded it and held it up, remembering how she used to wear it when he was out of town, how it had smelled like his cologne and made her feel connected to him even when he was hundreds of miles away. On impulse, she pulled off her pajama top and slipped the T-shirt over her head. It still fit, though it was looser now than it had been 3 years ago when her body had been different, when she had been different. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and saw a woman who was older now, more cautious, more guarded, but who was still capable of being moved by old memories and lingering love. She spent Christmas Day with Sarah and David, who were hosting a small gathering for friends who didn't have family in the area. Sarah peppered her with questions about the blind date, clearly fishing for details about David's mysterious architect friend, and Megan found herself giving carefully edited answers that weren't technically lies, but didn't reveal the whole truth either. The architect was nice, she told Sarah over coffee in the kitchen, while David carved the turkey in the dining room. We had a good conversation, but I don't think we're a romantic match. Sarah looked disappointed, but not entirely surprised. David said he was recently divorced, she said. Maybe he's not ready to date seriously yet. Maybe not, Megan agreed, grateful for Sarah's assumption and the easy explanation it provided. Some people need time to figure out what they want. The next few days passed quietly. Megan graded papers, read books, took long walks through her neighborhood, and tried not to think about Thomas or the conversation they had shared or the way it had felt to be held in his arms again. But despite her efforts, she found her mind returning to him at odd moments, wondering what he was doing, whether he had told Jennifer about their dinner, whether he was struggling with the same mixture of closure and renewed longing that had settled over her like a complicated blanket. She was surprised, therefore, when her doorbell rang on New Year's Eve, and she opened it to find Thomas standing on her doorstep, holding a small wrapped package and looking nervous. "I know I probably shouldn't be here," he said before she could speak. "And I know we said goodbye the other night, but there's something I need to give you, something that belongs to you." She stepped aside to let him in, noting that he looked tired, as if he hadn't been sleeping well. Virginia appeared from the kitchen to investigate the visitor, and Thomas smiled when he saw her. "So this is Virginia Woolf," he said, crouching down to let the cat sniff his hand. "She's beautiful." "Thank you," Megan said, though she was more focused on the package he carried than on his interaction with her cat. "What did you bring?" Thomas straightened and held out the small box, wrapped in simple white paper with a silver ribbon. "This has been in my possession for 3 years, he said. "I couldn't bring myself to return it or throw it away, but I couldn't keep it either. I thought after our conversation the other night that you might want to decide for yourself what to do with it." Megan took the package with hands that trembled slightly, though she thought she already knew what it contained. She unwrapped it carefully, folding the paper and setting aside the ribbon, and then opened the small velvet box to reveal the engagement ring that Thomas had given her 3 years ago. It was exactly as she remembered it, a simple solitaire setting with a round diamond that caught the light from her living room lamp and threw small rainbows across her coffee table. She had loved this ring when he first slipped it onto her finger, had spent hours admiring the way it looked on her hand, had imagined wearing it for the rest of her life as a symbol of their commitment to each other. "I couldn't return it," Thomas said quietly. "Even when I needed money desperately, I couldn't bring myself to sell it. It felt too much like giving up on the possibility that someday I might be able to explain everything to you and maybe, somehow, make things right." Megan lifted the ring from the box and held it up to the light, watching the diamond sparkle and remembering the night he had proposed to her in the sculpture garden at the Dallas Museum of Art. It had been a perfect autumn evening, and they had been walking among the installations, talking about their future, when he had suddenly dropped to one knee beside a piece called The Lovers and asked her to marry him. She had said yes immediately, without hesitation, because she had been completely certain that Thomas was the person she wanted to spend her life with, that their love was strong enough to weather whatever challenges might come their way. She had been wrong about the challenges part, but looking at the ring now, she realized that the love itself had been real, had been as strong and true as she had believed it to be at the time. "What do you want me to do with it?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "I don't want you to do anything with it. It's yours. It always was. You can keep it, sell it, throw it away. Whatever feels right to you. I just needed to give it back, to complete the circle somehow." She set the ring on her coffee table and looked at Thomas, really looked at him, taking in the details of his appearance that she had been too overwhelmed to notice during their dinner. He looked older, more tired than he had the other night, and she wondered if the stress of the past few days had been weighing on him the way it had been weighing on her. "How is Jennifer?" she asked, partly because it seemed polite and partly because she was genuinely curious about how his marriage was surviving the complicated emotions that their reunion had stirred up. Thomas ran a hand through his hair a gesture she remembered from the times when he was wrestling with difficult problems or decisions. "She knows I saw you," he said. "I told her about our dinner, about explaining what really happened when I left Dallas. She was understanding, I think, but also hurt that I had never told her the whole story before." Megan nodded, imagining how difficult it must be for Jennifer to learn that her husband had been carrying this secret, this unresolved piece of his past, throughout their entire relationship. "Are you all right?" she asked. "You look like you haven't been sleeping." Thomas sat down on her couch, and she noticed that he was careful not to sit too close to where she was standing, maintaining a respectful distance that acknowledged the complexity of their situation. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, "about choices, about the paths we take and the ones we don't take, about what it means to love someone and what it means to build a life with them." She sat down in the chair across from him, tucking her legs underneath her in a gesture that was automatic and familiar. "I keep wondering," Thomas continued, "what would have happened if I had trusted you with the truth 3 years ago? If I had told you about Marcus and the danger and asked you to wait for me instead of making the decision to disappear on my own." "There's no way to know," Megan said gently. "We can't change what happened, and we can't know how things might have been different." "I know," Thomas said, "but I can't stop thinking about it, and I can't stop thinking about you, about us, about whether the connection we had is something that people get once in a lifetime, or whether it's possible to find again with someone else." This felt like dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could lead them both into places they shouldn't go, given the circumstances of their current lives. But Megan found herself responding anyway, drawn by the honesty in his voice and her own need to articulate feelings she had been carrying alone for years. "I've wondered the same thing," she admitted. "I've dated other people, nice people, good people, but nobody has ever made me feel the way you did. Nobody has ever understood me the way you understood me, or made me laugh the way you made me laugh, or made me feel as safe and loved as I felt with you." Thomas looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race, and for a moment the space between them seemed to crackle with the same electricity that had once drawn them together. "I love Jennifer," he said, but his voice was quiet and uncertain. "She's wonderful, and she deserves better than a husband who can't stop thinking about his ex-fiancée. But I don't know how to let go of you, Megan. I don't know how to stop loving you." The words hung in the air between them, creating a moment of such raw honesty that Megan felt her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to reach for him, wanted to close the distance between them and see if the physical connection they had once shared was still there beneath all the years and complications and other relationships. Instead, she stayed where she was and tried to think clearly about the situation they found themselves in. "What are you saying?" she asked. "What do you want from me?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. "I don't know," he said finally. "I know I don't have the right to want anything from you. I know that I'm married and that I made my choice when I built a life with Jennifer. But being near you again, talking to you, remembering what we were together, it's made me question everything." He looked up at her then, and she could see the conflict written across his face, the struggle between duty and desire, between the life he had built and the life he had lost. "I keep thinking," he continued, "about that quote from the movie we used to love, about how love is the one thing we're capable of perceiving that transcends time and space. Do you remember that?" She remembered. They had watched Interstellar together dozens of times, had talked endlessly about the themes of love and sacrifice and the choices people make when faced with impossible situations. The quote was from a speech by Anne Hathaway's character about love being the only thing that could guide them across the universe to find what they were looking for. "I remember," she said. "I feel like that about you," Thomas said. Like the love I have for you exists outside of time and circumstances and rational decision-making. Like it's something fundamental, something that will always be part of who I am, regardless of what else happens in my life. Megan felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by his words, but also frightened by their implications. She understood what he was feeling because she felt it too. But understanding didn't make their situation any less complicated or any more solvable. But love isn't enough, she said softly. Love doesn't erase the fact that you're married to someone else, someone who loves you and trusts you and moved her entire life to help you take care of your brother. Love doesn't give us the right to hurt other people just because we want something we can't have. Thomas nodded, but she could see the pain in his expression, the difficulty of accepting a truth that felt both obvious and impossible. "You're right," he said. "Of course you're right. I just don't know how to reconcile what I feel for you with what I owe to Jennifer, how to honor my marriage while acknowledging that there's a part of my heart that will always belong to you." They sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts, both struggling with the weight of emotions that had no easy outlet or resolution. Outside, Megan could hear the sounds of New Year's Eve celebrations beginning, people laughing and calling to each other as they made their way to parties and gatherings. "Maybe," she said eventually, "the answer isn't about choosing between Jennifer and me, or between your old life and your new one. Maybe the answer is about finding a way to honor both the love we had and the commitments you've made since then." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked. "I mean that what we had was real and important and life-changing, and it's okay to acknowledge that, to carry it with you as a part of your story. But it's also okay to let it be what it was instead of what it might have been. You can love me and also love Jennifer. You can be grateful for what we shared and also committed to the life you've built with your wife." Thomas considered this, and she could see him turning the idea over in his mind, trying to find a way to make it work. "I think," he said slowly, "that what you're saying is that I need to find a way to let you go without erasing you, to honor our past without sacrificing my future." "Something like that," Megan agreed. "And I think I need to do the same thing. I need to stop using what happened between us as an excuse to keep everyone else at arm's length. I need to stop comparing every new relationship to what we had and start allowing for the possibility that I might find something different but equally meaningful with someone else." It was hard to say these words, hard to admit that moving on might mean opening herself up to the kind of vulnerability she had been avoiding for 3 years. But sitting across from Thomas, seeing the struggle in his face, she realized that holding on to their past was keeping both of them from fully embracing their presence. "Does that mean you're saying goodbye to me again?" Thomas asked, and she could hear both hope and fear in his voice. "I think it means we're saying goodbye to the US that might have been," Megan said. "But maybe we don't have to say goodbye to caring about each other's happiness. Maybe we can find a way to wish each other well from a distance." Thomas picked up the engagement ring from where it lay on her coffee table, holding it in his palm and studying it as if it might contain the answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "I want you to keep this," he said finally. "Not as a symbol of what we might get back, but as a reminder that you are worthy of deep, committed love. Someone is going to love you the way I loved you, the way I still love you, and when that happens, I want you to be brave enough to say yes." Megan felt tears spill over and run down her cheeks, moved by his words and by the generosity they represented. She reached for the ring and slipped it onto her right hand, where it felt both foreign and familiar. "Thank you," she said, "for the ring, for the explanation, for helping me understand what happened between us. It doesn't change the fact that you hurt me, but it helps to know that it wasn't because you stopped loving me." Thomas stood up from the couch, and she could see that he was struggling with his own emotions, trying to hold himself together long enough to leave her apartment with some semblance of dignity intact. "I should go," he said. "Jennifer is expecting me home, and I think I've probably complicated your life enough for 1 week." Megan stood as well and walked with him to the door. As he reached for the handle, she touched his arm lightly, stopping him. "Thomas," she said, "I want you to know that I forgive you. For leaving, for not telling me the truth, for all of it. And I want you to be happy with Jennifer, really happy. You deserve that. And so does she." He turned back to face her, and before either of them could think better of it, he cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her forehead, a soft, lingering kiss that felt like benediction and farewell all at once. "Be happy, Megan," he whispered against her skin. "Please be happy." And then he was gone, and she was standing alone in her apartment, touching the spot on her forehead where his lips had been, and listening to the sound of his car starting in her parking lot. She stood at her window and watched his taillights disappear into the New Year's Eve traffic, and then she sat back down on her couch and cried for everything they had lost, and everything they might have been, and everything they were finally, truly letting go. The engagement ring caught the light from her lamp, and she twisted it slowly on her finger, thinking about Thomas's words, about being brave enough to say yes when love came again. She wasn't sure she was there yet, wasn't sure she was ready to open her heart fully to someone new, but for the first time in 3 years, she could imagine the possibility. Her phone buzzed with text messages from friends inviting her to New Year's Eve parties. People who wanted her company as the year turned over and they all moved forward into whatever came next. She looked at the messages and realized that she didn't want to spend the evening alone, didn't want to sit in her apartment dwelling on the conversation with Thomas or the complex emotions it had stirred up. She changed into party clothes, put on lipstick and perfume, and drove to Sarah and David's house, where their annual New Year's Eve gathering was already in full swing. Sarah greeted her at the door with a hug and a glass of champagne, and Megan allowed herself to be pulled into the warm chaos of friendship and celebration. As midnight approached and the countdown began, she found herself standing on Sarah's back deck with a group of people she had known for years, people who cared about her and wanted her to be happy. When the clock struck 12 and everyone around her was kissing their partners or hugging their friends, Megan looked up at the stars that were barely visible through the light pollution of the Dallas sky and made a quiet promise to herself. She promised to stop living in the past, to stop using her heartbreak as an excuse for keeping people at a distance, to be open to the possibility that her greatest love story might still be ahead of her rather than behind her. She promised to honor what she had shared with Thomas while also making space for new experiences, new connections, new chances to be vulnerable and brave and fully alive. The engagement ring on her right hand caught the light from the deck lanterns, and she thought about Thomas's wish that she would be brave enough to say yes when love came again. She wasn't sure what that love would look like, or when it might arrive, or whether it would resemble anything like what she had experienced before. But as she stood surrounded by friends and possibility and the promise of a new year, she felt ready to find out.